Welcome to Mormon Land, a podcast all about the news and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm Senior Managing Editor Dave Noyce. I oversee the Salt Lake Tribune's faith coverage. I'm joined by religion reporter Tamara Kemsley. Hi, Tamara.
Hey, Dave.
Before we start, here's a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com, where for as little as $3 a month, you can access all of the Tribune's faith coverage, podcast transcripts, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/Mormonland. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at mormon.land. Now for today's show. Few groups exist in the world like missionaries of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. They may be assigned to different countries or speak different languages, but for 18 months to 2 years, tens of thousands of these mostly young proselytizers share the same strict schedule, routine, identity, and purpose, namely, to share the good news of and seek converts to their religion. More than 1 million have served in the church's history, so missionary stories are practically as ubiquitous in the 194-year-old global faith as soaring steeples, crying babies, and tiny sacrament cups. Some stories are inspiring, some are scary with odes to devilish humans and even Satan himself. Some are funny, and some are, well, tall on tell and short on truth. Here to talk about these narratives, some of which are cataloged at church-owned Brigham Young University, are folklorist Christine Blythe, Executive Director of the Mormon History Association, and her husband, folklorist Christopher Blythe, author of Terrible Revolution, Latter-day Saints, and the American Apocalypse. Together, they host the Latter-day Saint podcast, Angels and Seerstones. Chris and Christine, welcome.
Thanks for having us on. We're excited to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Great. Christine, let's start with you. What's the difference between folklore and history?
Oh, that's a good question. And certainly history informs folklore, or there's places where those two intersect. But when we think about folklore, we're thinking about the traditions of everyday people. And when we're talking about the academic study of folklore, we're talking about looking at those vernacular traditions and then tracing variants as those traditions move from one generation to the next or from one person to the next. So, of course, there's a history of folklore, or folklore has its history. But what we're interested in is kind of the living, breathing tradition, legend, traditions such as basket weaving, personal narrative, contemporary legend, conspiracy theory, rumor, things like that.
Chris, anything you want to add to that?
I really like that. I think, for the past 50 years, historians have brought in a little more anthropology, a little more cultural studies to their work. And so they might do some things pretty similar, but on the ground, when someone thinks about history, they're usually thinking about what really happened, the set, the events of time. And there's often in the past been an emphasis on institutions. And so in folklore, we're kind of pushing against both those ideas. We're less interested in institutions. We're more interested in people on the ground. And when we talk about stories, we don't really care whether they happened or not. We care that they meant something to the people that told them.
That's what we'll delve into that a little bit more. But Chris, what value do missionary stories have, both the real and the rumored?
Oh, my goodness. A missionary story, a mission's a really special place because here we have young people discovering their religion over time. They're immersed in their scripture. They're immersed in talking about it. And these stories tell us what they value, what they're concerned about, what they love, what their hopes are. Sometimes, rumored stories, whereas they don't tell us what's really going on, they tell me about the internal life of these young people. And that's pretty incredible.
Did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, I was just going to say that I think that these stories are so important because they are kind of ubiquitous in our society. They tell us a lot about what Latter-day Saints value. There's stories about conversion, kind of where the faith story begins for a lot of people. I'm a convert, Chris is a convert, so our stories begin with missionaries. But there are also stories about young Latter-day Saints, often, so many of them nestled in the Intermountain West, traveling the globe and having their first experience outside of their homes and interacting with people that are unlike themselves. the first time that they're interacting with people who believe different things than they do. So I think these stories are really important and kind of touch on a lot of those important themes.
And what is the downside or the danger, if any, in sharing these stories?
I think this is a question I get asked a lot as a folklorist, because folklore can be fun, it can be exciting, it can be informative, it can tell us about who a people is and what they value. But sometimes folklore can also be ugly and nasty. Sometimes it shows kind of the darker side of a group's belief system, or things that we as a contemporary society don't value anymore. And so continuing folklore that's outdated or nasty, I suppose, can have some pretty big repercussions. And so we see folklorists today, once upon a time, we wouldn't debunk folklore as folklorists. Today, contemporary folklorists more and more are looking at kind of the uglier side of folklore and doing their darndest to say, well, here's the harm in spreading this type of story.
I have, two different stories come to mind when we think about the problems that can come here. And if we have a second, I'd love Christine to talk about sister missionary lore. But the one that I think of, we're about to do an episode on it, is lore about a missionary who before his mission has a dream that he's supposed to bring the gospel to a friend of his from the pre-existence, which is a beautiful idea, right? That's beautiful. But this friend in the 1970s was always in Latin America, and the story was set up about him being less privileged or her less privileged in this terrible situation, and he was going to be, it's usually an elder, he was going to be sent to this, the best environment possible in the United States and have the gospel. And so there's an exceptionalism involved in that story. There's a sort of dismissiveness about the human experience of someone outside of this Latter-day Saint, presumably white experience. And so there's a story that I feel uncomfortable about related to missionaries. Christine, what's the one that you feel uncomfortable about?
No, that's good. I think ethnocentricity is something that we see a lot in LDS missionary folklore. Sister missionaries, we all know these stories, right? Why did a sister go on a mission? Well, because she couldn't get married, right? That's Latter-day Saint folklore. She was too ugly, to get married, so she decided to serve the Lord instead. But we have this story that is really popular about sister missionaries, in which she's out driving with her companion and the car breaks down, right? And there's not a gas station in sight. So there's a bottle of water in the car, and they decide, oh, well, the Lord can do miracles. Let's pray over the bottle of water. It'll turn into gasoline, and we'll go on our way. So they do this, and they put the water in the car, and of course, it completely totals the car. Now, that's a story in and of itself that's kind of humorous. But when you look at similar stories told about elders, we have stories about elders who are driving in their vehicle, and they make it from destination A to destination B. And when they arrive at destination B, they open up the car. The engine is missing from the vehicle. And the power of the priesthood got them from point A to point B with the sister's gasoline. Anyways, so we have stories like that are inherently sexist that we should stop telling.
So folklore also preserves our bigotry. It gets everything out.
How do they start? Where do they come from?
That's a good question. Where they start, that's almost an impossible question to answer. But how they start, usually in small circles, right? A couple of people share a story. Maybe it is actually derived from a real experience. Maybe an elder really does have a miraculous experience while he's driving his vehicle. But as that story is told again and again from one group to the next, and as the next generation missionaries come in and they begin to hear that story, it begins to take on unique and fantastic features. And if that story is meaningful to a group of people, then the story is preserved, it survives, it continues to be told. If a certain story doesn't carry weight for whatever the reason, then it's discarded and it disappears. It's no longer a part of kind of the mission canon or the cultural canon. And so I think that's what we find so fascinating as folklorists, is why does a particular narrative survive? You know, what kind of cultural value does it possess?
I'm assuming social media has changed this a lot. I mean, maybe it's just exploded it more, is what my guess would be. Is that true?
Yes. Yeah. It's a fantastic tool. It's changed the field of folklore quite a bit. But you know, when Chris and I are doing the podcast, of course, and Chris is fantastic at this, so he should be answering this question. He is the social media guru. He gets on and asks the question, and you know, within the hour we have 50 people responding to a question about their mission or a question about this or that legend, and everyone's got a story to tell. And so it makes it so that we can connect to people all over the globe, and that's lovely.
And you know,
Chris, go ahead.
We have, when I'm looking at Latter-day Saint folklore on the web, and I think this is one of the greatest resources that we can use in 2024, we have some. Latter-day Saints are often nervous about telling folklore in public settings. They love to tell it privately, but you can still find a lot. And so if you find the right Facebook group, you'll be able to do this if you ask people. But, you know, in truth, some of the best stories that you can collect come from ex-Mormon Reddit. You go on ex-Mormon Reddit and people are just sharing all these stories. And sometimes you can notice there's a slant that may be developed later on. But you have the core of that narrative that you're watching develop in a new setting. And so it's pretty exciting. But yeah, Facebook, Reddit, TikTok nowadays, both from faithful Latter-day Saints, fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, and ex-Mormons. All of them are providing such rich material.
And can I follow up with that? I wonder how the globalization of the church has impacted these stories.
Hit it, Christine.
Oh, golly. It's really interesting. It's really interesting. So yeah, we see all sorts of variants of certain legends, and missionary folklore is kind of the best example of this. But it's, you know, I might have to kick this question back to you because my mind's going in a different direction. When we're talking about missionary folklore, social media or not, missionary narratives are reaching well across the globe, and it doesn't matter whether someone served in Nevada or Japan or Africa. The same legend is making its way to those countries and back. How has social media changed that is, you know, I think just folklore in general is that we have different, you know, when we're talking about folklore, we're usually thinking about a smaller group or, you know, a specific group of people who are sharing the story. Suddenly it's made public. And so you have people from all over the world and other groups with other perspectives chiming in and either adding to that narrative or criticizing that narrative. And so I'm going to kick this back to you, Chris. I got to think through this a little. That's a great question.
You know, as a BYU professor teaching folklore, I have my students always do a big project. And this last semester, I had one where a student collected stories from different geographic locations across the world that told the story of a convert discovering a Book of Mormon with its cover ripped off. So he didn't know what the Book of Mormon was. He reads this trashed book and then is converted. And so 10 years later, he meets the missionaries and immediately converts. And the original story of this is, what's his name? Francesco, you know, this Italian guy.
Movie, right? Yeah,
there's a church movie about it.
I've seen that one.
Right. But it's been reset in Mexico and Brazil and Germany, all these different locations. The student that did it actually didn't know about the movie. He just knew this was a story that he kept hearing. And so we find these variants. I imagine, you know, we find Guatemala, the belief that this is Book of Mormon lands. We have a series of stories that come up from that. But really, this takes, and I hope one day the church gets involved in folklore, but it really is going to require people who speak the languages to get down on the ground and collect stories. And we can do a good job at BYU of collecting with our students that come from different nations. But one, absolutely, these stories are developing, and there are homegrown stories becoming adapted into Latter-day Saint context. You know, something like the aswang of the Philippines. Here is an idea, it's a lot like the skinwalkers of Navajo, but an idea of a creature that's all of a sudden takes on a sort of Cain-like persona once you have Mormonism introduced to it. You see a lot of that syncretism going on all over the place, but unfortunately, so much of this material that Christine and I have currently is translated from American missionaries, or at least Western missionaries or North American missionaries passing on that information. And so, yes, it's getting mixed up, but like in so much in Mormon studies in general, we have to find these researchers that can work in their local context. That's the great thing about folklore. It's what we're interested in, get these guys to actually study their own people.
Yeah, so a question, and this is for both of you, because I'm sure some of our listeners will want to know, well, you've told some stories now. For each of you, maybe tell one of your favorite or memorable missionary folklore stories, whether it could be funny, it could be, inspiring, whatever. Each of you, just tell us one that you remember, you latch on to, that you like to tell. Christine, do you want to start?
Oh, I'm going to kick it back to Chris so I can think through this for a second.
Oh, okay. So Chris, you're on the hook first.
Do you want me to do a scary one or an inspirational one?
Yeah, I'll do a scary one. You do an inspirational one.
We're going to ask more about some scary ones too here in a bit, but go ahead. Yeah. I
would say one of my favorite missionary stories that people have are actually, I guess I am going to do scary, Christine. Should I?
Yes.
A lot of times, okay, I'm scared. This Heretic movie just had its trailer come out. And so Christine and I dropped a new episode yesterday on tracting into psychopaths. Tracting, of course, is that Latter-day Saint phrase that nobody else uses, but it developed 100 years ago when people had tracts, and it means door knocking. And so there is this wonderful series of stories, and really every missionary has them, where you're going down and you're knocking doors, and maybe you're invited into someone's home, and all of a sudden, you're not supposed to be there. There's this just absolute sense of dread, and you find a way to get out of the situation. And maybe in the story, a couple that we collected the other day, the person chases you and they have a knife. Other times, you just have the sense of dread and you leave and the feeling dissipates. But every time you go back and tell other people about it. When I was a missionary, I can remember my trainer telling me this same story. Now, there's a subset of this sense of dread that people have, where it's your companion that's lost it in one way or another. And maybe
someone you're with 24 hours a day,
yes.
Right?
Oh my goodness, right?
Right.
Hopefully, usually you're with someone you trust and love, and you're having this great experience together. But like a bad roommate, you might have some struggles with this person. And there's a whole series of stories. I remember one that I was told soon after my mission, or soon in my mission, where a man's two elders are serving, and one elder begins to lose it. In fact, in the story, he begins to try to convince his companion that his grandmother is the head of a modern-day Gadianton robbers, and he wants this young man to pray about it. And so the other elder knows that his companion's crazy, but he goes into the other room and begins to pray about it. And right as he closes his eyes and begins to pray, he sees a vision of this companion standing above him with a knife. And he opens his eyes, and it depends on who's telling the story. But in this version, I don't think the guy was actually there. But he runs out of the house and calls the mission president, right? Things aren't safe. I kind of like that. Christine, are you going to talk about Gadiant and robber missionaries?
That's where I'm going. This is really hard for me. I love missionary folklore. It's probably my absolute favorite bit of folklore. I inherited about 4,000 folklore stories that were collected by folklorist Bert Wilson. He's late Bert Wilson, who is considered the father of Mormon folklore. And so I spent a lot of time with these stories. But my favorite bit of stories, and I actually was the folklore archivist at BYU for 4 years. And this set I tried to put up in, am I allowed to say this, Chris, you think?
Yeah.
I tried to put together an exhibit on this legend cycle, and as I pulled it together, it got sent up to administration, and I was told to pull it very last minute. I mean, day of. And so this is the story I'm going to tell, and there are many versions and variations, and all of you will be familiar with them. But there is a group of missionaries, typically elders somewhere, and it could be any state or country around the world. But when some subset of elders decide that they are going to form a secret society. Maybe they are the Gadiant robbers, maybe they are the 12 apostates, whatever they name themselves, they come up with initiation rites, or rites of passage in which they invite others to join the group. Sometimes that includes leaving the mission field and taking photographs of where they've traveled to. It includes dating girls or hot tubbing with sister missionaries in the baptismal font. Whatever it is. These missionaries continue on their way documenting in some book all of their naughty deeds. And one day, a general authority comes to the mission. Often this is an apostle, and the names change from time to time, but he comes. And
now, Christine, tell them who it is currently.
I don't.
This is President Holland, right?
It's President Holland. But you can go back decades and the name changes. But for the past, I'd say a couple decades, it's been President Holland. And he comes in and he walks down the row of missionaries. He's asked them to line up at a conference, and he either whispers in their ear or he taps them on the shoulder. He divides a set of missionaries to the right and a set of missionaries to the left. And he looks to the missionaries on the right and he says, "Good and faithful servants, go on your way. You're doing a great job." And he looks to the missionaries on the left and he says, "You're going home." So he comes in and he cleans house. And Elder Holland, or whoever it is, knows without any evidence by the Spirit who's a part of these secret groups. Anyways, this is one of my favorite. There are a million different variations, and they're told all over the world.
And sometimes it's called the Quorum of the 12 Apostates.
Yes.
Snaps for that. And that's interesting because it touches on the prophetic mantle, the import of worthiness. I don't know if you see anything else in there, but that's what stood out to me.
Well, so I find it fascinating. It's always elders, The sisters are almost never groups. And maybe that'll change now that we have more sisters, that have come into the field. So
sisters are dumb in these stories, and elders are disobedient.
And the elders are naughty.
Yeah.
Oh dear. What about sleep paralysis and missionaries? You did a episode on that was well received. Why do you think it was so popular and resonated with such a large audience?
I think because so many people have had this experience. This is a global experience. This isn't just a Latter-day Saint experience, and different cultures call it different things. But I think, and it happens, sleep paralysis, to people when they're really tired, right? And so it's not surprising that this is happening to missionaries. It happened to me before my mission when I was working 2 jobs, saving up to get out into the field. And I didn't have a demonic being come and visit me, but I did have sleep paralysis, and it was quite frightening. But it happens. It happens. And so people were really excited to hear us give us a name and a story, to share our stories, and they wanted to share theirs. So
I think David Hufford, the scholar, the folklorist who first identified this experience, estimated that 20% of people have this. And it's not just sleep paralysis. He calls it the terror that comes in the night. This idea that, you wake up, you're held down, and then you have a sense of complete dread, the sense of a presence. Maybe you see it, maybe you don't. But that people recognize it as one of the scariest moments in their lives, and that there's usually some sort of, if they're religious or have some cultural understanding of such an experience, they do some formula to get out of it. When I was a missionary, I was just called as a district leader, just a guy in charge of like 6 missionaries. And I got a phone call deep into the night where one of our elders had this experience, and he was in absolute dread and told us it, and we encouraged him to come over. And he came over, and I just remember shaking, like as he told me the story, like uncontrollable shaking, because I interpret this as an absolutely legitimate experience. I still believe the devil would be interested in tempting or deceiving or harming Latter-day Saint missionaries. But it really hit me hard, just hearing that experience. I wouldn't have it on my mission, but ultimately, as I was called to other leadership positions on the mission, I had the opportunity to travel around, and I'd always ask people about sleep paralysis. And at the end of my mission, I had 11 missionaries who said they had this experience. And of course, they were out there telling that story to others. Really, really fascinating. And of course, why does this appeal to us? Like a possession story, it's evidence. This is, you're in the combat zone, and you're seeing actual conflict. The same reason you like telling stories about when someone hits you with an egg. This is the same thing. You are being persecuted. You are in a real supernatural conflict. And what a great way of expressing that belief and telling this firsthand story.
So do you think that's also the reason why there's such a common thread of casting out evil spirits, or the presence of evil spirits in these missionary stories?
I definitely think that's one reason. Like Chris said, it legitimizes the missionaries' worldview, right? I'm out here, onward Christian soldier. I'm fighting the good fight. I'm doing the Lord's work. And if Satan tries to stop me, that only tells me that I'm on the Lord's errand, right? Like, I'm doing what I'm supposed to be doing. So I think that that's one reason why we tell these stories.
What about missionaries who may invite stuff? I mean, like Ouija boards or something like that. Do missionaries, some get into those kinds of things? And how common do you know if you even know?
David, that's what I was about to say. I was going to say it's kind of paradoxical, right? Like these stories that we tell. On one side, we see demons because we are good. On the other side of the coin, we see demons because we are bad, right? It's one or the other. Mm-hmm. Either we're on the Lord's errand and Satan's trying to stop us, or we're inviting Satan in. Ouija boards, that was one of the stories I was playing with as a favorite of missionary legends. We've got a great, set of stories about missionaries from the MTC into the field who have Ouija boards under their bed, one in which the mission president feels a prompting and runs down, and they must be living in the same home, and goes to the elder's door. And as he gets there, there's a legion of demons just flooding through the hall and into his room. And as they're casting out the demons, they make it into the door and they see him slain on the floor next to a Ouija board. So we have stories like that.
Is the missionary dead in that story?
It depends on the variant. I was going to say one of the most common stories is not about Ouija boards, but it's about the missionary who's doubting whether or not God exists or whether or not Satan exists. So he decides to pray to Satan. I don't know why, but that's what he does. He prays to Satan, and he's thrown from wall to wall, floor to ceiling. And it can get really violent and bloody in these stories. Sometimes limbs are missing or dents are in the wall and ceiling. And so sometimes we invite Satan in these stories. And in that case, they become cautionary tales about what not to do.
Now, Ogden Kraut, the well-known fundamentalist of the late 20th century, claimed that on his mission, one of his companions prayed to see the devil, and he went blind. So these are interesting because people will say, not only have I heard that story, but I was there. Very fun.
Why is the mission field so ripe for these stories? You've touched on this, but I want to unpack that idea a little bit more.
Yeah, this is... there's lots of things. It's a situation, when we talk about diabolism or demonic stories in general, it's usually where cultures collide. So if you want to study demonic possession, study the colonial period in America, right? There's just tons of it. Exorcism, the witch trials, all are rising at this moment. And so Latter-day Saint missionaries are getting sent out in foreign experiences where the culture that they've been protected within is now coming up against other forces. So there's a deep anxiety going on. They're being introduced to other religions. So particularly where charismatic religions are implied, Latter-day Saints have been apt to think of them as diabolic. So we see a lot of these stories in Brazil, in the American South, and the Caribbean, probably other places as well. And then I would say that Latter-day Saint missionaries we have them work night and day, but they have a lot of time on their hands as far as talking. And so that ability to converse, where do you find storytellers? You want to find a porch where people are telling stories, right? And Latter-day Saint missionaries are always going around talking about something. And so these stories have an audience and tellers readily available.
I also think, and this is probably just my own opinion here, but I think that we create this really interesting worldview for missionaries through initiation, right? When a missionary is getting ready to go out, they go to the temple, right? They receive their endowment, they receive garments, and then they're sent directly into the field, right? And they don't really have a handle on what they just did. But now they're grouped in the MTC and in the field with hundreds of other young people who are trying to figure out what it means to be endowed with power. What does it mean to have on sacred garb that protects them physically and spiritually? We're learning in the temple certain things about encountering Satan, right? There is this initiation process that missionaries go through that orients them towards the spiritual, and that orients them towards thinking of themselves as warriors, as prepared to face off with Satan, I think, in some ways, right? And so I think that process that missionaries go through right before they enter the field has a serious impact on how they view what they're doing, how they're creating their new identity as servants of the Lord. Of course, folklore itself informs it. informs the experience. And so before you go out into the field, everyone's telling you their missionary stories. If someone encountered Satan, they're going to tell you about it. You're in the MTC, your mission president, your stake president, your mission companions, everyone's sharing these mission stories. And so you already have like this entire canon of stories that you're walking into the field with. I'm expecting XYZ to happen to me because it happened to everyone else I know. And so you're out on the looking for that particular, experience to happen to you.
And the key to every one of these stories isn't, a horror movie can end where the sort of devil figure wins, right? Sometimes, certainly modern horror. But in these stories, traditional exorcism type stories, it's always under the control of God, right? There's like trials of doubt. There's moments where you think, Joseph Smith's first vision where he's going to be, subsumed by this creature. But really, at the end of them, you find out that there was a formula they needed to perform, that their priesthood or their endowment enabled them to conquer this. And so they're really stories for people that are already anxious, already experiencing anxiety, to then tell a story of how they conquered it. And I think we don't often get that. Sometimes people think, particularly Latter-day Saints, don't talk about the devil. This is something that could bring out more evil and so on. But these are really stories about Latter-day Saint strength.
One last question, and I'm not sure, since whether their quote stories are true or not sometimes may not necessarily matter because you really can't tell many times. But is there any advice for former missionaries who tell their stories or for members who hear them? Do you guys have any advice for that?
I love story. It's what brought me in.
So you're saying, yeah, tell me. Yeah, I want to hear it. Yeah.
I want to hear them all. I think Chris is right. Sometimes these stories tell us about the authority that missionaries hold, that God is on their side, that they're doing a good work. I think there's power in telling your story. And as we mentioned, sometimes there are stories we shouldn't perpetuate. But as a folklorist, I want to hear them all. So,
I think there is such a culture among Latter-day Saints where we're nervous about sharing sacred things. We don't want to blaspheme and sharing something we shouldn't share. When, often when I talk about our podcast, I say, if you're the sort of person that goes to fast and testimony meeting and someone gets up and talks about their dreams, or they heard a voice, or they tell a travel log, and you get upset, you think, why aren't they just saying, I know Jesus is the Christ, or I know the Book of Mormon is true? If you're that sort of person, then you're not going to like our show. Because our show is about these stories.
Right.
It's owning the Latter-day Saint weird, right? It's owning, but really the reality of the Latter-day Saint experience. This is what Latter-day Saints are like. These are the stories that mean something to us. And so they're told, and if we're saying you can't tell them at church, or you can't tell them around certain more uptight Latter-day Saints, you are finding other outlets to tell them. And maybe that's on the mission, maybe that's around a campfire. It's usually at home with your family or close friends. And gosh, that's the Latter-day Saint culture that I'm most excited about.
Interesting. The name of the podcast, again, is Angels and Seerstones. Christine and Christopher Blythe, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
It was fun. Thanks, David. Thanks, Tamara.
And thanks to Tamara Kemsley.
Had a blast.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. Remind you that you can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Solid Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrib.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.